The pre-flood and early post-flood world. The pre-flood world is perhaps the most mysterious period in history, with the beginnings and the tail end of this period being known while the middle is largely unknown. The origins of the world starts with God creating the world and all that was in it in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. He also set Adam in charge of keeping the Garden of Eden. After Eve sinned and caused Adam to sin also, they were banished from the garden. Now after Adam and Eve were banished from Eden, they went out of the garden, with no particular direction pointed out. I'm guessing they dwelt somewhere in the outskirts of Eden or somewhat close to it. And after this they had 2 sons, and many daughters, as is pointed out later in Genesis 5-4, and their 2 sons' names were Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel because his offering to God was rejected and his brother's was accepted. Cain then was cursed by God, and he took one of his sisters as a wife and went east of Eden. Here his wife bore Enoch, and Cain built and named a city after his son's name. So around the area of Mesopotamia, which would have looked very different back then, is where early people created communities and built cities. We don't really know how far early man made it before the flood came. "1,650 years is an extremely long time. Perhaps man settled the entire earth in these years. After Cain's departure, Adam and Eve had another son named Seth. Seth was born when Adam was 130 years old. After more genealogies, the Bible says that the whole earth was filled with violence and that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. God then told Noah to build an ark because he would destroy the world. And in 120 years the entire earth was destroyed by the great flood. Now the Garden of Eden was at the head of a river which split into 4 rivers. This is believed to be in southern Iraq. But also in these times the Persian Gulf was likely dry land. Perhaps the great river which split into 4 was further south, and that is possibly where the Garden of Eden is. There are many places that are currently underwater which weren't even 2,000 years ago. Places off the coasts of Egypt, Japan, Cuba, and India. So, it would be no surprise that after a worldwide flood, the division of the continents and sea level rising, that Eden could be underwater. There is even thought to be a sunken subcontinent in Southeast Asia. The Great Flood was recorded and told by many ancient civilizations, including the Sumerians, the Chinese, the Mayans, and even the Aztecs. There is a relatively new theory that interprets the wealth of ancient flood stories as myths that stem from a cataclysmic event which wiped out and destroyed most of the people of a very advanced pre-Ice Age world with only a few survivors. This is a secular theory, and those who believe it think there is a hidden history of the world. This theory is false and rejects the biblical chronology. The chronology of evolution is a stumbling block for many. This causes them to reject the Bible as truth and believe in a false worldview which blinds them from seeing the truth of the history of the world. One of these ancient flood stories can be found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. You can tell the similarities between it and the true story of the flood. But these nations which retold the flood altered the true flood story and told their own stories. They went the way of Cain and created their own gods which would line up with their stories. Now after the flood, the Bible says that all the people were of one language, and out of the east they went to the land of Shinar, which is Mesopotamia. Shinar is the Hebrew word for Sumer. Here Nimrod and all of the people of the world built the Tower of Babel, rebelling against God, and after some time their language was confounded and God scattered them across the earth. This was the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom. Nimrod was an empire builder, and he was the first king after the flood. After Babel he went on to build Akkad, Uruk, and many other cities in Mesopotamia and even Nineveh in Assyria. Beside the brief mentions of him in the Bible, there are many myths and extra-biblical accounts of him which I take with a grain of salt. All we truly know of him is that he rebelled against God by building Babel. He was a mighty hunter, and he built many great cities. There are ways to link ancient figures to him, but many of these figures are also mysterious. people like Hammurabi, likely a name which is derived from Ham or a variation of Ham who Nimrod was from, and Sargon the Great. But these figures are seen as conquerors of cities while Nimrod is described as a builder of cities. Another interesting thing about the early post-flood world is the structures people built. The ziggurat is one of the first buildings man built after the flood. The Tower of Babel is believed to have been a ziggurat-like structure, although most depictions of it are cylindrical. Interesting enough, the Mayan pyramids are considered to be ziggurats, and if you compare the Mesoamerican structures to those in the Old World, they look extremely similar. Now Pangaea is a very interesting concept. Pangaea is the idea that all land masses were one supercontinent at one point in time. Scientists will say this was so millions of years ago and the continents gradually drifted apart. But as Bible believers we understand the world isn't millions of years old. In Genesis 1:9 it says that all of the water was gathered together into one place and that God said, "Let the dry land appear." According to this verse all of the land was in one place. So Pangaea is true. And as you can see by looking at any map of the world, the continents fit together like puzzle pieces. So, when were the continents divided? There is much debate about this subject. Some think the continents were divided in Peleg's days according to Genesis 10:25, and others believe it was during the Great Flood. I stand closer to the Genesis 10:25 explanation, but I do think that the flood could have caused minor geographical changes. Peleg was alive 100 years after the flood, during the Tower of Babel, so Genesis 10:25 is about the Tower of Babel, the scattering of nations and the division of continents. It is also important to note that the ice caps which covered parts of the earth formed land bridges between continents and islands. When these ice caps melted, sea levels rose, and this is why many places around in the past have sunken. The world of the pre-flood and post-flood was much different than it is today. The Middle East and North Africa were luscious and green, and there is evidence that the Sahara Desert was tropical, which means that the soil in northern Africa was perfect for farming. This and also the river valley in Egypt is what made the Egyptian civilization develop quickly. On the other hand, Europe didn't benefit because there was ice which covered northwestern Europe. This means that Europe was much colder than it is today. This and the lack of river valleys, such as were in Egypt, Mesopotamia and China, kept Europe from civilizing as fast as those peoples. Even the first inhabitants of Greece had trouble farming on a mass scale, but they prospered through trade. Now to the wildlife. It is no secret that dinosaurs roamed the earth in the ancient days. But because they were predators, men in early civilization found ways to slay them and would be praised as heroes for doing so. There are countless dragon legends of the ancient world that I believe have some truth in them. And perhaps the latter dragon-slaying myths were just influenced by the ancient legends. But I do think these myths have some truth. I don't recommend him, but Kent Hovind gave a great explanation for why dinosaurs went extinct. When an area gets civilized, the predators are either forced out or they are killed off. For example, before the Spanish settled California, in the second half of the 18th century, there was an estimated 10,000 grizzly bears in present-day California. Now the grizzly bear is extinct in the state, with the last grizzly bear being killed in 1916. Dinosaurs which were much larger and terrifying would have posed a greater threat, and those who slew them would live on through oral traditions and later in books. These stories can be found throughout ancient cultures. Even the Mayans, who were supposedly isolated from the old world for 12,000 years, created dragon art. Now if dragons just a figment of ancient imagination, then how did the isolated Mayans know of them? My explanation for this is that there were dragons or dinosaurs in the Americas. But I do not believe the Mayans and other Native Americans were isolated for 12,000 years. I would say they crossed Pyrenea in two migrations, one in around 1600 to 1200 BC and the second migration happening in the 1st century BC. As you can see, the first 2 millennium of the world were extremely interesting and important times to understand in the history of the world. There are many topics to discuss on this subject. So, hope you enjoyed in peace.